If you look at most religions, there are three major layers. There's a secret layer, okay, which is only available to the founder as well as his closest followers. There is a inner layer, okay, an inner layer, which is what he teaches his disciples. And there is a public layer, an outer layer, okay, which is what he preaches to the public. Okay, do you understand? So most religions will have this three-power system. A secret layer, which is the secret teachings, an inner layer, which is what the disciples are taught, and then there's a public layer. Okay? So, and what's important for us to understand is these three layers operate at different levels, and they speak different truths, but they're all interconnected. Okay? They're coherent, and they're one and the same.
Did you know I was personally dragged into the whistleblowing about the sexual abuse, trafficking of vulnerable women at the nonprofit organization with a false accusation by the female central to my story? I had support from some famous people like...
One man told me about being beaten by the police and left permanently disabled because of a woman's false allegation.
Hello, it's November 2025. Now, over the many years, I've discussed in some of my content something called Freeman on the Land. And even in recent times, I've discussed Freeman on the Land 2.0 as I'm observing how this is being resurrected once again. And it appears every 10-15 years, a person or a few people try to resurrect all this, using, for example, as a descriptive pseudo-law to circumvent things that they don't like that's happening in society, especially with the legal system. Now, I do understand, and anyone who's been following my story knows this, I do understand the frustration with, for example, corruption and so forth in the system, especially the legal system. And I have various perspectives of this. But this is not what I'm discussing here today, because I want to be expanding on something that I recall, I think it was in my last video on this topic, when people are trying to, for example, tap into money that they think belongs to them. For example, based on their birth certificate or anything else. And I do explain in some depth the issue with all this. Now, I'm trying to remember now, 15 years ago, when I really took a deep dive into this topic and was even invited to some of these online forums. This is before social media groups and all this other stuff really became popular. And as always, I didn't last long because I didn't tell people what they wanted to hear. And even back then, people were, for example, trying to pay bills using imaginary sources of money or money that they think belongs to them to pay their bills. And I highlighted in this video that I did last time, for example, where do people, putting everything else aside, where do people think this money's coming from? If it does exist, if it did belong to them, hypothetically, this money has to come from somewhere. Now imagine, I'm just going to reiterate this part real quick. Now imagine if everyone, say in the country like Canada or the US, taps into this. It would literally overnight bankrupt the country. Like, it would just put everything at a standstill, because people are tapping into something that doesn't exist and doesn't belong to them. But I'm going to expand on this a little bit further here, because I don't think some of these so-called Freeman on the Land gurus who are promoting this stuff really understand the legal ramifications of what they're telling people or suggesting for people to do. For example, paying bills using, in this case I'm going to be talking about actual bills, for example, a debt of a product or a service. And if they do realize this, then they're just setting people up to fail. And there's never been one successful story that has been proven. We hear lots of stories of success, but never anything that has been proven. That's key. I remember historically people saying, "Oh, we arrested the judge and the crown prosecutor or the prosecutor, this and that, and the police on the roadside because they refused to have a driver's license or license plate or anything else." No one ever talks about what actually did happen afterwards. And I did expose this a long time ago, but I'm totally going off tangent. Now, there are individuals who have been, for example, talking about when you have in the mail a bill, and the bill comes in, and this could even be electronic, but we'll just go with the paper version because it's probably more simpler. And these people are saying that these bills, like for example, whether it be a hydro bill, water bill, and I know I'm talking about a very sensitive topic because no one likes to pay bills, because especially in today's world right now, the prices of everything have gone insane and people are struggling to put food in their bellies and their families and everything else. It's really insane. So I know this is a very sensitive topic, and this is why it's very important right now to highlight the dangers of what some of these so-called gurus are talking about, because it's only going to land people in a lot more trouble. So when you have your bill come in the mail and there's a section that you send in with, for example, your payment, we'll use a check for example because it kind of relates here. You have your bill. What these gurus are telling people is all the information to pay that debt is on that piece of paper, allegedly. Well, not allegedly, it is. But not to pay that bill using the bill itself. And this is the problem here. What they're saying is you have to tweak the bill, add some information to it, and then simply submit that bill as a check and have your bill magically paid from some unknown source of funds. The number one problem with that's criminal. And I know there's people who say, "Oh, I've been studying this stuff for 20, 30, 40 years, and they're referring to definitions that are 100 years old and everything else." I don't care. I'm telling you, today's world, that is illegal. And there's different ways to look at it from a legal perspective. I'm just going to touch up on, for example, counterfeit. You've now created a check, what appears to be a check, by manipulating a bill that doesn't exist. And the fact that anyone who would do this does so knowingly with the intent of whether the money belongs to them or not is not the question, but from a source that does not belong to them. So they're deliberately creating a counterfeit check by manipulating a document. Now that's another criminal element here. There's probably about, I think I counted 3 or 4 possible criminal elements here that the person who manipulates or creates a fraudulent check, a counterfeit check, can be dinged for with serious consequences. 10, 15 years in prison. Now here's the other thing that no one really talks about. So whoever accepts that check, whether it be an individual or a corporation, now that corporation or individual can be found in some criminal fault as well for trying to cash that check or whatever. Now when you're dealing with a big corporation, I'm going to backtrack here for a moment. I remember 10, 15 years ago when people were trying to do this type of stuff, they sent this fraudulent counterfeit check in, never heard it back from that. They assumed that it worked. We never hear about any repercussions or any investigations that took place afterwards. Now here's the thing. Whoever is taking in the bill payment may just assume, without actually looking at anything, oh yeah, here's a bill payment, and just shuffle the paper, whether it be digitally or physically, across their desk and move forward with it without even paying attention. But still, there's some due diligence that needs to be taken, for example, by a corporation or a business or even an individual, to ensure that even on its face, that check is not a counterfeit check or fraudulent check. There's a lot of legal ramifications that can happen, that can have devastating effects on people if people actually listen to these so-called Freeman on the land gurus. And they are a dime a dozen again, and people are accepting what they want to hear because of their frustration, especially in today's world. And I've said this before, that we are in a silent depression. And I've given examples of comparing, for example, the 1930s Great Depression and today, and how actually today people are living more poor than they did in the 1930s, believe it or not. So I understand people's frustration, and these gurus are playing on these people, and the ones who really bite into it are the ones who, as a descriptive, are weak-minded, extremely desperate, trying to find a way out. And unfortunately, there's no changing or escaping any of this. So if you're one of these people who have come across one of these videos, and these people are very convincing when they talk about creating these counterfeit checks by using a bill and adding to it and changing a few things, and then submitting that to pay that bill, so that bill payment does not come out of their own personal bank account. Don't do it, because it might be initially accepted. You might not hear anything about it, even for say 6 months or a year, but it will come back to haunt you greatly. And this is the warning that I'm giving with what comes to these Freeman on the land types. They are deceiving a lot of people, a lot of desperate people, especially in today's world. So just to reiterate what I've covered actually in my previous video in depth, but I briefed, where do people think this magical money's coming from? If it did exist and it did belong to them, there's not money just sitting around in some big pot that people can just reach into and take what they need. And even if it did exist, that would go dry very quickly. That's number one. And number two, when you create a counterfeit check, and I should mention, and I'm going to simplify this not to make it complicated, but a check is basically, as a very loose descriptive, a form of currency. And it's no different than, for example, creating counterfeit money. And I'm sure everyone knows that that's a very, very bad thing to do, creating counterfeit money. So why would you do that with a check to pay a bill? Putting that burden on someone else. Now, could the world be a much better place? Sure. But now we're going to be dwelling into fantasy land, and I'm not even going to go there. Let's stick with reality and how the world is. And again, there's no changing anything. However the world is, and across the board on any topic, it's going to play out. And all you have to do is survive the best you can. That's all we can do. Anyone. And you have to remember one thing, that even those who you perceive that are opposing you, or people who, for example, people who are working in the justice system, law enforcement, government, at the end of the day, they're just people as well, individuals. Regardless of, for example, who they work for and people's perceptions of that, they're just people trying to survive, doing the best that they can. Perhaps they put themselves in a little bit better position in life. That's another topic of debate. Or somebody who has been really wealthy because of their business decisions. Don't let jealousy interfere with yourself. Just survive. That's all you can do. And don't buy into these free men on the land gurus who, it appears now, they're rebranding themselves, saying, oh, we're not free men on the land. I forget what they're calling themselves now, but it's still the same thing. Things to think about. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share.
Remember, their aim is to get to the end of history. And what does that mean? The end of mankind. They are a doomsday cult, and what they're trying to do is destroy mankind.
Just remember, I was one man against many. Fighting a losing battle, but I still fought to the end.
That means press on. That means endure. That means God cannot fail, and you're not going to give up. That's not an option for a child of God. This means you are going to be free. Listen to this and write it down if you can't remember it. You're never going to outgrow warfare. You simply must learn to fight. I hear people saying to me all the time, when is it going to get easier? When you die.